Well, last year, the Parliamentary Budget Officer earned the scorn and derision of the government with his report on the costs of the F-35 program. In March of 2011, Kevin Page took issue with the numbers that the government was using, about $15 billion, and said, in fact, it would be double that over the lifespan of the jets. That estimate, a little more than $1 billion a year for the program, was essentially the same found by KPMG. Joining me now, Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer, Kevin Page. Mr. Page, good to have you back on the program.
To be here.
You know, even with the KPMG report out, there still seems to be a lot of confusion in this country as to how much these planes are actually going to cost. How much per plane is Canada going to have to spend for the F-35s?
Well, I think if we're just talking about acquisition, so the purchase price, and the government set aside $9 billion, we're talking about 65 planes. So, I mean, to us, you do the math, you're talking roughly about $140 million a plane.
Now, that's way above what the government is saying.
Well, they quote a different figures, something much lower than $90 million range with some upward movement. And we think there could be an upward movement in the 140. But they've set aside $9 billion for 65 planes. So that's effectively $138, $140 million a plane. And that's not far off what we said 2 years ago.
Right. Now, the other thing that came out last week was this question about the reset button, that there's an admission that the process didn't work before, therefore we've got to re-examine the process. But we are a long way away from an open competition with other manufacturers. Are we going down the right path now, in your view?
Well, first off, it's from my view, the process that we've had up to date, certainly our experience in 2010-11 was a complete failure. And I think a lack of leadership, both politically and I think by public servants as well. So it's very difficult to rebuild the process. I think trust is damaged. I think Parliament is looking for a debate. Is this the right plane? They want to see the requirements. Very few people saw the requirements. KPMG only saw a limited version of the requirements when they were doing their audit. We saw a limited version of the requirements. I think parliamentarians want to debate, is this the right plane? What are we paying for stealth? What are we paying for performance, payload, other features of the planes? And how does that compare with other planes? And then they want to look at industrial benefits in the same context. So I don't think you get, if trust is broken, I don't think you get, in terms of a reset, trust back until you have that debate in front of Parliament.
So you're calling for a parliamentary debate on the F-35?
Well, it's not my call. My call is basically, I'm a Parliamentary Budget Officer, we'll do numbers. But certainly, sometime next year they're looking at options. You're looking at other planes, super fighters or Rafales or Gripens. We'd be happy to look at numbers and help cost them in a way that you can compare. What are you getting for F-35? What would you get in other planes?
Let's stick with the process for a second. From everything that you've seen, the process, the numbers, do you believe that Canadians were deliberately misled about the costs of this program?
Well, very clearly, back in 2010 when we released our report, and then a year later when the AG released his report, it was clear from the AG's report that there were numbers that existed at D&D that were much higher than what was presented to Parliament. And the Canadians saw the lower set of numbers, and things were taken out of those numbers to make the number even as small as possible. So in that sense, they were misled. Clearly, they were misled, and I think that's a failure again in leadership, both at the public service level, and I think because and a failure politically, but I'm more comfortable talking about the failure at the public service level.
How do we avoid this in future? Because we've got a shipbuilding program coming up that's in process right now. Are we in danger of going down the same road with the shipbuilding process that we have with the airplane acquisitions?
I mean, there's always a risk. But even when we looked at the reports, I was going through the reports, even last night, reading all the reports again that were released this week, in D&D's report, KPMG's reports, the Industrial Benefits Report by Industry Canada. When I look at the reports, the D&D report, it's a good report. It's actually very similar to what we had done a couple of years ago in terms of structure, but even more comprehensive, well-written report, the numbers, more or less we could live with those sorts of numbers and a good framework for going forward. But then if you think of the process, why didn't we have that report 2 years ago? My sense is that report existed 2 years ago, something very similar, and so there are bureaucrats, like myself, that exist deep in the bowels of D&D that can do the work. And but I think there were public sector leaders and political leaders that said, no, we're not showing the work. So I think there's a capacity exists within the public service, but it's been hidden. And I think, can we go down the same road with ships? Yes. if we're not careful, we can do the same. I think we have a 7-point plan, but I think really what we needed were some principles around transparency, scrutiny, and debate. And I think if we don't get those principles, then yeah, we could have problems with SHIP as well. And my office is working on SHIPs.
They may be working on SHIPs, but you're not going to be around that much longer to oversee that process. Your term is up in March. Have you got any idea who's going to replace you yet?
No, as we were saying, we have a PBO cliff. My mandate is up in March of 2013. There's nothing going on. I've not been contacted about what's going to happen post-March 2013. And we do have big files that we're working on. I think there will need to be some type of an extension, if not for me, for somebody in my office appointed indirectly. We're worried about it a little bit in my office because of the importance of the work and the need to get this work out. But yeah, I've got no sense right now that there's any momentum to replace me come March 2013.
Are you worried that they're just going to leave the post vacant?
It's a risk. It's very much like other risks, and I think they're like other risks. If not effectively managed, there will be cost to it.
Your term has been marked by, shall we say, confrontation or butting heads with the government that increased over time. You've even gone to federal court to try and get documents that you say are necessary to fulfill your mandate and your job. When the next parliamentary budget officer is appointed, if in fact there is one, do you think that tension is always going to be part of the job of the PBO, or does it have to be diminished?
No, I mean, this type of tension that we're talking about is very healthy. I think when people go out and they buy homes, you want to look for, before you make that purchase, you want to find a home inspector who's not somebody's best friend. I think you want to create some healthy tension in the system. I think in a legislative budget office, and these offices exist around the world, you want to have this type of tension. We focus on big files. We're a small office, so we can tend to look a little bit more adversarial. But these, some of these issues that we've talked about, the F-35 or crime bills or, sustainability around old age security, we found it, early on in this process, the government not being transparent. Eventually, they are transparent, and the numbers turn out to be we're quite similar. I think we can get to a better point faster with just a bit more transparency.
Kevin Page, Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer, at least until March. Thank you very much for being here. Always good to have you on.
Thank you.
Now, for his response to the PBO's comments, we're joined now by Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence, Chris Alexander from Toronto. Mr. Alexander, good to have you here. Some pretty strong words from the PBO. What's your reaction?
Well, Tom, I think it's a bit rich for the PBO to be saying there's a total failure of leadership for a project where no money had been spent. And let's remind everyone that our CF-18s are aging, but we don't yet have a new aircraft, nor have we taken a decision about what aircraft to purchase. There was a process 2 years ago that was taking us towards that decision. It proved earlier this year, in the eyes of the government, and also because of some commentary from the Auditor General, to be inadequate. And so we've reset that process. We've made that process much more robust. We're going to look at options. We've done an independent review of costings for the F-35. A lot of that work came forward this week. But we still haven't bought an aircraft. We're still some way away from buying an aircraft. I was glad to hear the PBO saying that the report from D&D was of a high quality. We agree with that. I think anyone who's interested in this issue would do well to look at the 6 reports that came through this week. But when it comes to accusations about misleading Canadians, I think we all need to be very careful. This is the rhetoric we get from the Liberals, who didn't do much defense procurement over 13 years in office, and from the NDP, who vote against anything that we put forward for the Canadian Forces at all.
Let me just stop you there for a minute, because I think that while the PBO did praise that report, and you're quite right, he did say that it was kept out of view for 2 years, and he said it should have been brought forward. But let me ask this question here, and I think it's foremost on everybody's mind. If you're hitting the reset button on this because the process was flawed, and if at the same time the contention is that the F-35, as your government has said for 2 years now, is the only plane for the Canadian Forces, and that's been said many, many times, why not just go through an open process with all the other competitors? And if the F-35 truly is the best plane at the best price, it will survive that process, and this issue presumably will be over very quickly.
Well, Tom, we'll see where we get in 2013. This options analysis, for which terms of reference have now been put forward, and which is going to take place in public, is going to be very robust. We had the usual process up until 2010, 11, early 2012, the one that DND has used for many other procurements in the past. But because of the scale of this challenge of finding a CF-18 replacement, we decided that it needed to be strengthened. And the Auditor General gave us reason with his report, which did make a recommendation, which we accepted, to do just that. And so we've created a National Fighter Procurement Secretariat, analogous to the secretariat that that has led us through the shipbuilding procurement strategy so far, but different because obviously the challenge is different. And that brings together many departments in government under the leadership of Public Works. It brings together much more expertise.
Yeah. I guess, Mr. Alexander, the question is this on a lot of people's minds. A, why wasn't that done right from the beginning? Why did we have to reset? Why are we 20 months behind in the process? Why are we maybe going to open bidding, where a lot of people said, why didn't we do that at the beginning to find out what the best plane was? I mean, at the end of the day, this was such a flawed process. How do you prevent this from happening again, especially, as the PBO was saying, the danger that this could infect the shipbuilding process as well?
Well, I think the shipbuilding process has gone extremely well so far, Tom. It has gotten high praise in Canada and outside of Canada. The reaction from industry has been good, and it is hitting its timelines. On this issue, I think there's some confusion of fighter jets, because we have been working as a country to develop the F-35 with 8 other countries for 15 years. So people have been hearing about that. They've heard about the companies that are getting contracts in Canada for that work. There was a report on that this week. 72 companies with well over $430 million of contracts so far, up to $9 billion of potential opportunities over the life of the program, over decades. But that doesn't mean, none of that has ever meant that we have decided which aircraft will replace the CF-18s. And we are still in that process. We're still years away from actually acquiring a new aircraft.
I'm sorry I have to cut the conversation short here because we are out of time, but I think you have to admit that for a couple of years the F-35 was the plane, and we heard that from the Prime Minister on down. But Mr. Alexander, this will be a conversation that will continue, and we'd love to carry it on with you in the weeks and the months to come. Thank you so much. It was an intention.
It wasn't yet a decision to purchase, but thanks very much for the opportunity.
Okay. Well, we did invite the Minister of National Defence, Peter MacKay, and Public Works Minister Rona Ambrose on the show this week. Both declined our invitation.